Town centres range from 12.5 metres right up to 48.5 metres in a small number of cases. Again, the 12.5 tended to be the historic character town centres. And up at the 48.5 end, I think that's Avondale's in that category. Pakuranga. Yep. So this is the notified plan, and the metropolitan centres were generally 72.5 metres, and I think that equates to about 18 levels or so. So that was the approach in the notified plan. The submitters, in terms of the location of office and retail, they considered that more of these growth corridors needed to be identified, not just Lincoln Road, to accommodate expansion of commercial activity in the future. Others felt that that wasn't required, that we should have a strong centres approach, centres only. Some wanted more flexibility for supermarkets, department stores, bulk retail, and office right throughout the business zones. In terms of the supply and protection of industrial land, some submitters were asking for more flexibility to get retail and office into industrial areas. Some wanted to enable existing heavy industry that's sitting in the light industrial zone to continue to operate. So we do have some areas within the light industrial zone where there is a more noxious, more heavy industry site. We didn't spot zone those sites heavy industry, but that did generate quite a lot of submissions saying, well, I'm clearly heavy industry, I'm discharging to the air emissions and so on, but I'm sitting in a light industrial zone. So we heard submitters asking for some changes there, and some wanted to delete the requirement to publicly notify resource consents for retail and office in the light industrial zone. In terms of design issues and heights, most submitters were concerned that the provisions were too restrictive and will create unnecessary resource consents with no real benefit, leading to inefficiencies and delays. Some wanted to increase the height limits, some wanted to decrease them across the board or in specific town centres, and some wanted to remove the control. We had a control that had a minimum storey height of possibly 4 metres, and some wanted that control deleted. We then received the interim guidance from the panel on the regional policy statement business provisions, and they indicated that they supported commercial growth on transport corridors and centres. They thought that was a good approach. They had a concern that some of the policies were trying to manage trade competition between retailers, and they felt we were stepping beyond what you can do in the Resource Management Act. And they considered that the urban design controls, which they hadn't heard in detail at that point at all, but they felt from what they'd read in submissions or looked at in terms of the plan, they were too detailed and too restrictive. Our position at the hearing on the commercial issue, 5 new growth corridors were identified. They were worked through with local boards, identifying these corridors: Lincoln Road, Stoddart Road, Waira Road to Irarangi Drive and New North Road. So more flexibility for commercial activity would be allowed on those if the panel accepted or recommended that back to the council. Changes to the activity status for supermarkets in some locations, and a new rule to require resource consent for small-scale retail in the mixed-use zone that's not anywhere near a centre. And that was a concern, that the mixed-use zone could actually turn into a new de facto centre and actually kill off the retail in an existing centre, and all of the benefits in terms of investing in transport and civic amenities in that centre could be lost as a result of that dispersal out into the mixed-use zone. In terms of protecting industrial land, a bit of recognition of existing commercial activities, office and retail, in an existing heavy industry in the light industrial zone. So it's not a pure zone that has no office or retail or heavy industry at all. So there was some recognition in policies that there are some individual sites that don't entirely fit 100%, but it didn't make sense to spot zone those sites. Amendments proposed to the air quality overlay or air quality amenity policies from high to moderate in the light industrial zone, and an amendment to delete the requirement to always notify retail and office in the light industrial zone, and it was replaced with that notification assessment under the RMA. In terms of urban design and heights, Some of the urban design rules were proposed to be deleted, simplified to become more efficient and focused on the critical must-haves from a design point of view, but they were supplemented by assessment criteria, design criteria that would still achieve the same outcome. So many buildings, most buildings in centres will have to come in for resource consent rather than having 35 rules to comply with. There are a smaller number of rules, but there is a design assessment process to pick up on design issues. Amendments to clarify that growth and development in appropriate locations is a positive outcome, and amendments to delete that minimum story height and increase the height standards slightly in some town centres and in local and neighbourhood centres and the mixed-use zone. Key examples, 12.5 to 13 metres for some of the town and local centres and all neighbourhood centres, 16.5 metres to 18 metres, and this was off the back of some detailed urban design analysis in the mixed-use zone and some of the centres, and 20.5 metres to 21 and 24.5 to 27 in some of the other town centres and mixed-use areas. And that's it for business from the regional policy statement down into the various business zones.
Questions on the business category? Councillor Cooper?
Thank you. Your comments about these corridors, if they're allowed to have retail displacing metro centres, I mean, you've seen that result there in Lincoln Road already, industrial being sort of unfettered retail. So I'm just kind of not, is that where it says the interim guidance, the second part of the interim guidance, is that what the panel are talking about, saying they think that's restrictive not to allow retail in those areas, or because it's not very well explained? Are they saying there that they think that retail should be allowed in those areas or not?
Just to check, is this the correct slide up on the screen here?
Well, you've got interim guidance.
Yep.
I'm looking at topic 051, maybe it's not the RPS, sorry. No, business zone provisions I'm talking about. Or does someone want to do on the RPS first? I'm just talking about business zone provisions. It's on page 29.
You are talking about the interim guidance, is that
I'm talking about the interim guidance,
so
yeah.
if we can get that slide up.
The second point.
It was the one you were just on previously, I think. That's the one?
Yeah.
And you were talking about one of those bullet points?
Yeah, so you said, John was saying, you know, that we're concerned, our position is we're concerned if we've got metro centres and then we allow retail and office space into light industrial, we displace growth and development in the metro centres. And I mean, classic example is Lincoln Road. We've got two metro centres within 5, 6, 8k of each other, and that's slap bang in the middle. And we've seen the rampant kind of, I suppose, disregard over time of elected people making decisions around that. So is that what what you've talked about, having in the council's position at the hearing, to have a resource consent, to have that it can't be as of right, but when it says in the second bullet point, what does the IHP mean when they say that?
So the idea behind identified growth corridors is that we would like to get all commercial activity into centres if we could, but there's just not enough space for all the retail activities that we expect to be needed in the future.
You mean in the metro centres, so
Exactly.
they're concerned that there won't be enough space, so it should go in the corridors, or it can go in the corridors?
Preferably to go into corridors rather than dispersed around the area or around the region even more. So having a long one corridor is preferable from a transport perspective, rather than having all these different places set up with
If you had good
commercial
public
activities.
transport along the corridors, it would be, but anyway.
So
Okay.
in Lincoln Road, it's not a great environment, we know that. But to say that we wouldn't necessarily allow any more commercial activity, or that more commercial activity there shouldn't take place.
It's not the commercial, it's the retail, that's the problem.
Yeah, you're right, the retail activity.
So that's what it's saying.
We'd find it difficult to turn the clock back in terms of trying to get rid of that retail. So we've identified that as a growth corridor, in the sense that more activity there could take place subject to resource consent, and taking into account particularly effect on those proximate metropolitan centres that you talked about.
So could I just ask, Mr Chair, but we've never seemed to ever take that into account before. Will this, if the unitary plan says that we should, that means in a resource consent that'll have to take that into account, because before, we've never taken that into account before. We've just said, even if a council's had a strategy that says we're going to have development here and here, it doesn't seem to be able to be taken into account when they're doing the resource consent. So will this mean that now that will have to be taken into account? Considering it.
I think previously councils have tried to take it into account, but I don't think the plans have always been very well expressed in terms of giving a cohesive strategy in terms of how to do that, and I think the unitary plan perhaps is a step forward. So you think that'll give that better guidance? I certainly think the guidance is better. I think it's a tough area because the law around commercial activities and the effects they have on centres is a little bit vague. It's a little bit hard to show that, say, a new commercial activity is having an effect on a centre, and that's through a series of environment court decisions that's happened, you know, over the life of the RMA. So it's always an ongoing battle, but the idea is that now we've got a better strategy. Perhaps we can actually slow that growth and get commercial activity into more appropriate locations.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr Chairman.
Mark Thomas. Just a clarification question on the new height levels of town centres. So that's just an increase from 12.5 to 13 metres, John, for those, obviously, town centres for which that applied, right? Because there were a range of minimum heights, weren't there, across the different town centres?
It's probably best to Chairman.
Yep, that's right. There is no standard height for town centres.
No, that's
so
right.
As you know, you look on the map and that'll tell you what the height is.
Yeah.
So depending on what height you're shown in the notified version is 12.5, that would increase to 13.
And I mean, that's still 3 stories though, isn't it?
The idea is that would still be 3 stories, yes.
It just gives what more, why the increase, I suppose, isn't it?
The increase is actually designed to try and make sure that there is only 3 stories in there. So with an increase to say 13 metres or from 16 to 16.5, because we deleted the minimum story height control, there may now be an avenue for developers to say, hey, I can fit an extra story in here. You know, that's going to increase my yield quite a lot. And so you might try and squeeze floor stories into where before you could only fit 3. It'd be quite a strong incentive to do that because your yield would increase. And so that's why we've got the slight increase, but also the 2 metres for roof form. So the effective height has actually decreased in terms of the stories you can fit in.
2 metres for roof form or 1.5 metres?
It varies on, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just looking at commercial growth, transport corridors, as well as in centres, how do you deal with a situation that may have been alluded to before, where we'll see all this peripheral development along corridors and we don't see the integrity of a centre, and the situation where it's not sustainable, you can't walk anywhere because everything's just all over the place. So we got a mechanism for dealing with that, and obviously there's the related.
Start again.
Well, we can't start again.
It's like Huapai Kumeu, isn't it, Wayne?
We can't start again, but at least we can try and get on top and don't have things worse than what we've got, because it's a bloody nightmare. Oh, excuse me, I didn't realise I was on camera.
Did you have a
Well, say it again, Wayne. Take two.
I guess the response is that, you know, ideally we'd like to see these activities in centres. As I said, we don't really have the space for them. You know, developers now like to have large format retail activities. Along those identified corridors, we provide for some of those large format retail activities to take place through a consent process. When appropriate, we don't allow for small activities. So we're not trying to create another centre, a long strip centre. We recognise that in a lot of those large format retail activities, people will be driving anyway. They're often not popping from one small activity to the next like they do in a centre, so we kind of think it's making the best of a bad situation.
Okay, and other issue just around the heights, I'm assuming we've still got flexibility and a customised approach to circumstances, and I can think of one centre where it's on a ridge, so those earlier customised heights are still in place?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John, just a query. You said when we're on slide 29, and we're on the third bullet point at the bottom of that interim guidance on 29, around urban design controls, you said that was their response, but they hadn't actually read the detail at that time. Yet the comment here is that the urban design controls were overly detailed and restrictive. Can you just expand or explain the panel's interim guidance if they hadn't actually seen it?
Well, we can only assume that they had read the provisions and read some of the submissions, but they hadn't heard council's evidence or the evidence from submitters. But while they were going through the regional policy statement hearings, some or potentially all of the panel had read the business zone design controls and read some of the submissions. That's all we can assume.
But they
So
hadn't.
they're foreshadowing some concerns prior to the hearing commencing.